Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today for what promises to be a really exciting event with Councillor Susan Aitken. Apologies for the slight delay. We had inevitable Zoom hiccups at the start, as often happens, but hopefully you can join us and hear us loudly and clearly now. And we've got about 45 to 50 minutes today, a curated question section as well. So I'll bring in some participants at that point, and those of you joining us on Zoom can also ask any other questions via the Q&A function, and hopefully we can include as many of those as we can. Today's event builds on learnings from Glasgow's story, and Glasgow are part of our inclusive growth network of places as well. And to hear about inclusive growth in policy and practice from Glasgow City Council's leader, Susan Aitken, which I'm delighted to see is with us today. CVP works with 12 inclusive growth member places all year round, and so today we're going to find out a bit more about what inclusive growth means and how we can deliver it. Maybe there's some learnings for other cities and places as well. We're webcasting the session on YouTube, Twitter and Facebook, so please do tweet and post comments there too, and we'll try and bring those in. And just quickly before we start, a quick reminder about CPP's events and all other work. If you want to see what we're doing, see what we're up to, and sign up to future events, please do subscribe to our newsletter. So without any further ado, hello, Susan, hope you're okay. Nice to have you with us.
Thanks very much. Pleasure to be here.
Brilliant. So I suppose the first, maybe obvious, but also the most challenging question is, what do you think inclusive growth means for Glasgow?
Okay, yeah, it's a big one. I suppose there's a couple of things of very long-standing challenges that we have in Glasgow, which have been very resistant to various policy interventions over the years. And, you know, I'm assuming that folk listening will be reasonably familiar with Glasgow's story and background. We are, you know, one of Europe's preeminent post-industrial cities. The experience of post-industrialisation was a brutal one, and we live with the legacies of that today. The city has, you know, also an extraordinary story of regeneration, of recovery, of renaissance. But despite all of that, and despite the fact that in the post kind of 2008 crash era, economic growth in Glasgow was really very, very strong, there's still sections of our population, particular communities, that just has never reached. And in particular, it manifests itself in a couple of effects. One of which is in ill health, premature morbidity and mortality, long-term illness and disability, which then exclude people from economic engagement, economic participation. And the other is low skills. And we have a real tale of two cities in Glasgow. We are actually one of the most highly skilled cities in the UK. Among the UK core cities, the 10 biggest outside London, I think only Bristol is higher than us for the level of degree qualifications amongst our population. But we also have had persistently either the highest or close to the highest of our population who have no recognised skills or qualifications at all. Now it's a much smaller group than the more highly qualified group, but nonetheless it is persistent, and it's been persistent for decades now. So those two particular indicators really stubborn to policy interventions. So I suppose, you know, if I could only pick on a couple of things, I would pick many, many more, but it would be real inclusive growth, and the impact of that would start to turn those indicators around. We'd start to see the children in particular coming from the households and families where there is long-term worklessness, that they would enter participation in the economy, that they will not only develop skills, but they'll have the pathways and the opportunities to employ those skills and to get real gain and benefit from them, essentially to change the economic circumstances and financial circumstances of themselves and their families, and that we see the health status of Glaswegians, and particularly the poorest Glaswegians, improve significantly. So, you know, if there were only two things to pick on, those would be the things that we really, really need to see the difference on, because they do have that, you know, it's a vicious circle of a lack of inclusive growth contributes to those problems persisting, and with the enormous human cost of those, but alongside the human cost, that then perpetuates our sometimes inability to reach our full economic potential and our full growth potential as a city. And so, as I say, we've had very good growth, but we haven't been able to demonstrate that inclusive growth where it really matters up until now. And it's why, certainly for the past 5 years, we've really sought to shift economic development, the way we do it, the way we approach it in the city, to put that inclusivity part of it as the absolute priority front and centre. So not just bringing any jobs into the city, but jobs that will contribute to us turning around the life circumstances of the people who are still living with that post-industrial legacy of the last 40 years or so.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Susan, and a really wonderful, lucid answer as well to that question, and much of what you said chimes with the work of CPP and the Inclusive Growth Network as well. Now, obviously, we are in incredibly challenging times at the moment, and we always seem to be from one form of economic crisis to the next, you know, whether it was the pandemic, and now obviously we have a cost of living crisis. How do we, and I absolutely agree with your aspirations for where you see your city and what inclusive growth means for it. How do we get to grips with that challenge and keep those aspirations while also navigating these particularly difficult and turbulent economic times?
I mean, I think that is the big question that's going to be facing local leaders, and indeed, you know, in governments right across the world, but I think most acutely in the UK just now. How do we keep our eyes on those long-term goals, medium and longer-term goals around inclusive growth, around transition to net zero as well? I mean, absolutely massive. COVID recovery, economic and community recovery that actually delivers change and actually contributes to those ambitions as well, and not just get caught up in the firefighting of the absolute catastrophe that's facing a lot of our citizens over the next, you know, probably at least the next 18 months, where we have people already living in poverty and contending with all of the impacts of that, are going to be pushed even further into poverty, and you know, some of the, and into crisis. So people who, you know, are maybe living in poverty but are able to maintain their own home, have been paying their rent, become at very, very real risk of homelessness. You know, so we are going to have genuine potential crises, growing crises on our hands, and in fact we're already seeing it in our homelessness applications in the city, for example. But also it's not just those citizens who we have, I suppose, been focusing on particularly, but a whole swathe of other folk who have been not particularly regarding themselves as at risk of financial crisis in their own homes, who have been managing by and large, who maybe wouldn't regard themselves as living in poverty, are now going to be pushed into poverty because of what they're facing. And, you know, we've got the interest rates announcement today on top of the inflation. You know, so are people now going to struggle to pay their mortgages as well as their fuel bills, and you know, as well as feeding their families? So, you know, there are now multiple impacts coming through on folk, and you know, it is at the heart of what we need to grapple with. We first and foremost are going to want to get that safety net under people, to get, frankly, to get money into households, to maximise household incomes as much as possible. And coincidentally, we have a full council meeting in Glasgow tomorrow, and I'm taking a motion on this very subject. Essentially, I think we're going to be looking at every spare penny we've got as a local authority, and we don't have very many, if any, that's where it's going to be directed. It is going to be targeting those most at risk of of genuinely being pushed into crisis, of homelessness, of hunger, of family breakdown, for example, as a result of spiralling addiction issues, as a result of what's coming. But then we've also got this other cohort of people who haven't required our assistance before, who haven't been at risk, who haven't been vulnerable, who are going to become vulnerable. How do we respond to that? And there's only so much that we can do as a local authority as well. And of course, we are at the whim of a lot of what national governments decide to do with their far greater powers. But at the same time, we still need to continue to focus on that economic transformation, which, if we don't continue that journey, we're going to constantly find ourselves in firefighting mode. We're never, it's just going to be constantly trying to keep people's heads above water, when what we really want to be doing is getting folk onto dry land and able to walk to their own future on that dry land and create their own futures. So I'm not sure I've got the answers to it. I think we are going to, a big focus for us is going to be, really looking at different ways of working, how we look at the way that we deliver services just now, which have been through a process of reform to be much more people focused, for example, but just how we can really accelerate that and maximise the impact of every single public pound that we spend, so that we don't just deal with someone's addiction issue, or we don't just help someone out with rent arrears, but when we deal with a person and we put a support plan in place for them, it deals with every single aspect of the challenges in their lives and gets them to a point where they can say to us, that's great, I don't need your support anymore, I'm able to move on. That's what we're looking at just now, really trying to accelerate and embed those kinds of ways of working, not just with us as a council, but with our partners in the NHS and the third sector as well.
Yeah, thanks for those answers, Susan. I'm also intrigued by the fact that you've recently called for cross-party consensus around cost of living. Is that the kind of things that you've been talking about, how to build cross-party consensus around those areas that you've mentioned, enabling Glasgow to thrive ultimately through providing initial support, but then taking people throughout a journey for aspirational purposes as well. Maybe you could add a bit more about what you've been calling for from a cross-party point of view.
So I think, really getting us collectively as a council behind an approach that we have common agreement on, so that we essentially, we're then mandated to go ahead and deliver on that, because what we are facing an emergency here, and our households and our constituents are facing an emergency. So I think we need to be in a place collectively, and I don't think it'll be any surprise to anybody if I say that Glasgow has a pretty robust local politics, but to a certain extent we're going to have to, if not park them, set them aside and say, this is our priority, this is our collective priority. And where changes are being made to the way that we've done things traditionally, we're going to have to get behind that, rather than having a big fight over whether we do things differently or not, because change is always a process that there is nervousness around, and sometimes just oppositionalism, and that's it's a temptation. I understand, I've been in opposition in the past, but we don't really have time. We are facing an emergency, and we need to get ourselves into a position where we are maximising the effectiveness of reaching out to the people that need us, and getting prevention in place before they become homeless, before they spiral into addiction, for example, before crisis happens in their lives. And that is going to require a political consensus as much as possible. I should say I don't think it's going to be terribly hard to achieve. I'm hoping, and every indication is that we are in Glasgow broadly all in that place where we want to be able to drive the change that's required quickly, and accelerate work that we've already started.
I'm pleased that you're optimistic about that, and just linked to that point, and a question from the Q&A to bring in at this point, I think it's quite a useful one, is around the extent to which Glasgow City Council feel they know the people that aren't benefiting from growth and where the most vulnerable lie to this cost of living crisis. Do you think you can pinpoint the specific areas and people and communities particularly well?
I think we know much better than we used to. We've done a lot of work in recent years at different, in sort of different ways, which has given us data that allows us to respond quickly. And in actual fact, and I'm sure lots of other local authorities have found themselves in this position, the work that we did, particularly in the early part of the pandemic in response to lockdown, when we needed to get to people, we needed to deliver food to people, which isn't something that a local authority usually does on the whole. That has given us a huge amount of data, and I think we have a bigger, a more detailed and a richer picture of need across the city than we've ever had before. But it also ties into, in order for it to inform inclusive growth. So we've got, there's that two sides of it, and it's coming back to that, the firefighting alongside the longer term work. We've got a picture of where we need to respond to, so we do a holiday food programme, for example, which we've been doing for a few years now, where we provide activity programmes and food during the school holidays when school meals aren't being provided. And it's been enormously successful. It's reached tens of thousands of kids in the city, hugely popular. So we know we need to step that up, but that isn't necessarily it's a great programme, but is it impacting on the wider circumstances of the household? Are we then reaching out to the parents in that household, or the carer, the guardian, to support them into employment? Are we making them aware of wider opportunities that are available around cheaper or free childcare that would support a woman into employment, for example? So it's how we make those connections. And we've been very lucky. The Glasgow City Region City Deal is one of the oldest, most mature in the UK in terms of delivery, but also in terms of governance. And one of the things that we've done at that city region level is create an intelligence hub and fund that, which focuses on a lot of that economic data. And what we're now doing is trying to bring those together. So there's the families that we know are accessing our holiday food programme. Have we got information about the skills level in that household? Have we got information about, is disability or long-term illness in that household standing in the way of someone accessing economic opportunity? And more we're able to bring those things together. We're not where we need to be yet, but I think what we've certainly learned is that the more data driven you are, the more effective you can be then in actually putting those actually often very personally tailored responses to citizens and their needs in place. And I should say our partnerships with the third sector, which have also just been spectacular. They were good during the pandemic, absolutely amazing, because they are working so close to communities and are community-led to a very significant extent. Again, the intelligence and the information they bring us in partnership is absolutely invaluable in reaching people. But there's always going to be a constant drive to find, to identify and match unmet need, because there is always unmet need in our communities, and particular sections of our communities that are less likely to come forward, that are less likely to make themselves known to us. So it's, you know, that's a constant learning process as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're currently involved in some work about poverty and its connections with health with the King's Fund at the moment, and we're exploring particularly how data might be able to identify changes within communities and particular vulnerabilities as well. So something that's really chiming with work that's ongoing. I'd like to move a little bit to some of the longer term stuff. I know obviously we've mentioned how it's part of a process, you know, how dealing with cost of living is also then part of a process to ultimately building inclusive growth and taking people on a journey. And I suppose there's nothing like climate change to sort of resemble that long-term challenge, but where we need to make quite significant gains in a relatively short period of time. And we just did some work through the Inclusive Growth Network, and Glasgow City Region's economic strategy was highlighted as a really good example of a practical strategy that was integrating economic inclusion, net zero, and public health. It'd be great to hear a bit more from you about your vision for the city from a net zero perspective, and in particular how you ensure that transition is fair for people too.
So this was something that we've really put a lot of focus on over the past couple of years from being COP26 host city. And I have to say, I think that has really focused our minds on it in a way that it might not have done had we not had that opportunity in the platform. But also I think the responsibility, I was very conscious that by the time COP came along and we went into it, we needed to be clear about what we were saying and to be providing leadership, I think, for cities particularly, and what cities are doing in this space, and for, I suppose, for municipalities more widely. So we did do a lot of work on trying to understand how we align net zero ambitions with social justice ambitions, and how you essentially make climate justice and social justice inseparable. And I think there's something there about the, you know, we're going to be spending huge amounts of money on the transition to net zero, more than we have, really, the local authorities have spent in a very long time, probably, you know, in the post-war era, and by which I don't mean we're spending it from our own resource, because we're talking about billions here. Some of that will be public money, but probably the vast majority of it will come from other sources, will be from private sources. But what we do need to understand is, you know, if we're going to be spending, and our estimation in Glasgow alone is 30 billion. And that's a fairly early estimation. We're putting a lot of meat in the bones of that just now, but 30 billion to get us to net zero by 2030, which is our target. A lot of that, you know, big interventions around retrofitting homes, for example, 450,000 homes across the Glasgow City region, and big investment in transport decarbonisation. The same things that other cities are doing, but, you know, they'll vary slightly according to local circumstances. But, you know, we haven't invested £30 billion in the city in the space of 10 years ever. You know, I don't think that's ever happened. So how do we make sure that every single one of those pounds that is spent delivers multiple outcomes? So it delivers for us in terms of, you know, so we always come back to housing retrofitting as being an obvious one. Where you can see a direct link between the investment in the fabric of people's homes, and at the same time in shifting them to renewable energy sources, affordable renewable energy sources, and tackling fuel poverty, which has always been an issue in Glasgow. Significant numbers of people living in fuel poverty, but now, of course, is something that is absolutely on the radar of everyone, everywhere, because fuel poverty is going to go through the roof. But so there we have a big infrastructure solution, but you can see a direct impact on on people's lives and then on their health, because we know that fuel poverty has a big impact on health, and then but also on skills and employability, because we're going to need a whole load of skilled people to deliver that work. And we're going to need local businesses who are employing those people to deliver that work as well. So you're then tying into your community wealth building agenda, and you start to see how a whole number of aspirations and policy strategies that we've adopted within the city, how they come together. And I think maybe that's the, sorry, that's my dog, apologies. I think that's the challenge for a lot of us is we know what we want to do, and a lot of us have got really good strategic plans informing our policies and our delivery at local level. When you've got something massive like the climate emergency with now a cost of living emergency alongside it, how do we bring all of that together? How do we make sure that it's working as a whole system, and that we're hitting all of our objectives and all of our targets simultaneously, particularly when there's such significant levels of investment going into it. So I think that's what we've been really working to understand. And of course, and you mentioned it, just transition underpinning all of it as well, that the poorest are not paying for this. And I always see that in a city like Glasgow, where we do have a lot of people living close to or in poverty, the climate agenda is often talked about in the context of giving things up, of the sacrifices that we make, and for a lot of us who are better off, that's we're quite happy to talk about that, but I'm uncomfortable having conversations with people living in deprivation, asking them to give more up. I think we need to have the conversation about climate transition with them in the context of what they stand to gain, of how they benefit, of how those communities benefit. And that's, for me, that's the heart of just transition. That you make sure that the transition benefits those who need it most, that it doesn't cost them, whether that's in their household bills, whether that's in job opportunities, whether that's in the public services available to them because of the investment that we are putting in. So that's the heart of just transition, I think, for me.
Sorry, I have a bit of background noise here as well. I can't say I've got a dog with me, unfortunately. But I'm really interested in much of what you're saying, and in particular around, and this links back to what you were talking about earlier around quality employment as well, and how do we ensure that the jobs that come through the transition actually do provide those opportunities for the communities that you are now targeting through cost of living and through all the rest of it. And I can see certainly there's a framework there. What are the next steps in the process from Glasgow's point of view to make all of those things start to become a reality? So it sounds like you've already got brilliant strategy in place. What are the next steps in terms of skilling, in terms of the jobs and linking the jobs to the skills, to the places that are so key to making sure it's inclusive?
So I think possibly the biggest thing that we have to do, and we're making progress on it, but it remains a challenge, is to make this not just Glasgow City Council. It needs to be citywide. It needs to be a whole Glasgow approach, with every partner on board. Now, that proves challenging even within community planning. Even sometimes cross public sector working isn't easy to deliver and isn't easy to get everyone on board. We have very good partnership infrastructures in Glasgow. We work very closely on not just with public sector colleagues, but universities. But the most important people in this are going to be employers. And trade unions are enormously important as well as part of the discussion. But the skills and the employment thing, it's the end point who are absolutely crucial. We need them to be part of this conversation. So I think that's where we are right now. We've done some early work on just transition and skills, bringing together the National Agency Skills Development Scotland, for example. Apologies, I don't know what the equivalent south of the border is off the top of my head, but national agencies, colleges, the funding councils for colleges and universities, and some key organisations like our Chamber of Commerce. We now need to expand that out and bring employers and workers directly into the conversation. So we've kind of created an agenda that we understand, but in order to deliver it, we need to make that a real citywide conversation. So that for me is the next step and the absolutely crucial step.
Well, thanks for that. I'm going to go to a few questions now. One first from the chat itself, from Val McNee. So she says, as well as the remediation activities you've mentioned, such as school holiday programmes, what do you see as the council's role and key contribution to fundamentally changing economic circumstances of Glasgow's poorest families? And I think you've touched on some already.
Yes, hello Val, I know Val. So yes, I think you know, I have touched on some of this work already. So that community wealth building approach that I talked about, where I've had some conversations with people about community wealth building where they've said that it replaces inward investment, that inward investment is somehow you know, I think something that takes away is a net loss to communities a lot of the time. And I think done badly it can be, but done well and with putting just transition, fair work, things like that at the heart of your inward investment strategies, it can, you know, making sure that it is adding value and not subtracting value. It's done really well, but undoubtedly that kind of higher level investment on its own, without having a clear understanding of how that then generates and retains income generation, wealth, employment, skills within our communities, then it's only ever going to be one-sided. And so we've done a lot around community wealth building on a whole, but it's been kind of different strands of it. So we're working just now and again pulling that together into an overall strategy. But taking it the next step. So again, you know, understanding that we as the council, the NHS, we have enormous spending power and we have enormous procurement power. But in a city like Glasgow, we also have some big corporate employers. Thinking of somebody like Scottish Power, the universities are huge employers. We have 5 universities in the city of varying sizes. You know, we did a huge inward investment deal back in 2018 with Barclays, who have regenerated and built a new campus and regenerated a previously kind of long neglected part of the city with their new campus, and are bringing about 250,000 new jobs. So again, it's about growing the approach beyond just what we do as a council, which will always come up against its limits, and trying to create a consensus across the city where an employer like Barclays says, actually, we are going to use our procurement and our spending power to keep that within the community that we are situated in as much as possible, in the south side of Glasgow. I think we're pushing at an open door in that respect on a lot of in a lot of ways. But what we need to provide to other organisations is clarity about what that means and how they go about it. So we need to have a very clear strategy of how do you actually participate in this community wealth building project. So you know, there's a lot of work going on that just now. I mean, I could spend a long time talking about this. The kind of broad inclusive growth programme that we've undertaken in Glasgow. I talked about fair work. We developed an inclusive growth diagnostic, which we applied across a range of policies, which generated some priorities for us to invest in that we could see where they would have real impact. So transport was one. affordable transport, that basic thing of people being able to get to their jobs. Glasgow has very low car ownership, household car ownership, affordable childcare, or wherever possible, free childcare, those kinds of things, as well as being, yes, they support low-income families, they support households in improving their circumstances, but they are also they underpin inclusive economic growth as well. They are both great economic outcomes and economic enablers at the same time. So I could spend a lot of time on it, though, and I'm conscious of time, so I'll shut up.
Thanks very much for your question there, Val. I'm now going to bring in Mary Patterson from North Ayrshire, who's going to ask her question.
Hi, thank you both very much. Pleased to be here. I'm Community Wealth Building Coordinator at North Ayrshire Council, so interested to hear what you were saying there, Councillor Aitken. I guess maybe my question is a bit related to that, and how do you leverage the power of the private sector to support those inclusive growth initiatives, and practically, how do you do that and build those relationships?
It's a great question, and yes, Mary, you're absolutely right. North Ayrshire has been a pioneer and an exemplar of community wealth building approach in a very different geographic and demographic and economic context from Glasgow. But I think, you know, we've had a lot to learn from the work that you've done as well. Yeah, I think there's always I've found in Glasgow a nervousness about making demands of the private sector. I think there's a little bit of a hangover of almost, it was a sense of, we're just grateful that anybody wants to come and invest and bring jobs to Glasgow. So we're not actually going to, you know, we're not going to make demands of them doing that. We're not going to insist that the way that they do that adds value to the city. That them just coming here is enough. We've moved on from that significantly, and I think what we've found is that when you do go to the private sector with a proposition and say, and also you can demonstrate that it benefits them as well in terms of productivity, in terms of recruitment and retention of staff, all in terms of reputation as well. But we've gone to them and said, essentially, we are a fair work city, and we have embedded fair work and inclusivity in all of our economic approaches. How are you going to work with us to deliver that? How are you going to work with us to respond to that? I'll go back to the example of Barclays, just because it's been such a big one. And that was 2,500 new jobs coming into the city. And as part of the agreement with them, we've ring-fenced around, I get the number off the top of my head, it's around 400 of those jobs, which they agreed would be ring-fenced for citizens from either with disabilities or from particular parts of the city with high levels of multiple deprivation. Now, in actual fact, as we know, and as I think I started talking about, there's a big crossover in that Venn diagram, and that people with disabilities are more likely to live in poverty and be economically excluded in the first place. Our job then as a local authority is to demonstrate to them that we, working with partners, will ensure that those citizens have the pathways in, and that they come and take up those jobs, they will be ready, and that they will add value to what Barclays are doing in their business. So it's recognising it as a collaboration, I think, and I think that is a new approach, and it's difficult for local authorities. We come from a public sector ethos, if you like, and often we see the private sector and what they do as being inimical to what we want to achieve. It isn't necessarily, though, and I think there is a bit of a shift, and you could argue it's for self-centered reasons or self-serving reasons in a lot of cases, but I think we are seeing a move towards that more kind of activist investment, if you like, where the idea of corporate social responsibility is becoming deeper than just some charity donations. And there's a recognition that if you want to come into cities and you want to have a good relationship not just with city governments, but with citizens as well. And you want to build your reputation, and you want a long-term, you want to do good business in the place long term, basically, then the expectations of you now are going to be higher. So I think what we've found is that it's you need, as long as you've got the boldness and the clarity about what it is you want. I suppose what I would say is shy wains didn't get any sweeties. Just ask, or don't do more than ask. Insist. Say, yes, we'll do everything we can to support you through our planning functions, for example, but we expect something in return. We expect something back, tangible gain for communities and citizens in this city. And, I think we've found so far that the response has been, more positive than we might have anticipated.
Well, thanks very much for your question there, Very. Now I'm going to move on to Leslie Smiley. I hope I pronounced your name correctly.
Smiley.
This could be a possibly a related theme around skills. Leslie Smiley from Deloitte, please. Thank you.
And it is Smiley, but thank you, Ben. And thank you for the conversation today, Susan. I think hugely interesting conversation. And just on the conversation that you've just had, I absolutely agree in terms of private, public, academia. So many more businesses are talking about their purpose and what they can do. So really, really great to hear all of that. I guess in terms of my question, Susan, it's going back to your points around skills and training. Do you think that we in Scotland and within Glasgow are doing enough on the skills and training front to ensure that we're fit for the future, and that we're then able, I guess, the second part of that question, that we're then able to retain that talent within Scotland?
So I suppose my short answer to that is no. And it's not that we're not doing a lot or we're not attempting to do a lot. I think the scale of the task around skills and recruitment is so big just now that we're almost running to keep up with ourselves in terms of responding to the challenge. I think the intelligence and the data is changing so much as well. I had a conversation with a big private sector firm in the construction industry, well known in Scotland, just last week, where they said they currently have 400 vacancies and they're really struggling to fill those vacancies. Now, I've got, we in Glasgow have got in the near future a fairly large scale redundancy event happening with the closure of the Pladis McVitie's factory at Toll Cross. And we want to be able to transition those workers onto new work without there being any gap in their household incomes. So that kind of intelligence, that kind of data, that might not be an exact match between sectors, but in my experience, there isn't a sector at all just now that isn't experiencing challenges around getting the right skills into their organisations. So I think we probably can't do enough in terms of the skills creation, upskilling, skills matching with employers. It has got to be a huge focus for us at national and local level. And again, the more we can connect, the more that can be really intelligence led, so that we know that the skills development we're doing is in the right area, that we are actually training our kids in schools and in colleges, and also older people who are requiring to be reskilled, that we're doing the right thing for them. Most importantly for them, so that they get a good outcome out of it, but also so that we're not wasting time and resource, training people for a job that isn't actually going to deliver what they need, or in a sector that isn't going to be a growth sector in 4 or 5 years, or going back to the whole thing about just transition, the climate emergency is going to be obsolete, in a few years. We're not going to need gas maintenance boilers, gas boiler maintainers very soon, but we are going to need people who know how to maintain air source heat pumps. So it's in making sure that we're looking to the future, and that we're constantly re-informing and reassessing what we're doing in the skills space. But right now, my sense is that we can't do enough, and anything that we can do more is going to be constantly the challenge for us.
Brilliant. Thanks for your question, Leslie. And then I think we've got time for one final question from Katie, who works for Leeds City Council. Katie, over to you.
Hi, thanks for having me. Katie Dunleavy at Leeds City Council. Councillor Aitken, you mentioned when you were talking about retrofitting that was quite an sort of an obvious or sort of, I hesitate to say straightforward, but an example of tangible infrastructure investment that you could see where the reward would come across lots of different sort of domains. But are there any other perhaps more challenging or less obvious areas of work that would also give you some benefits across the net zero, health and inclusive growth agenda? Or, I mean, and the second part of that is then, or maybe is it just more pragmatic to just focus on the big ticket item if retrofitting, if that's going to deliver the most benefit, should you just be putting all your energy into that rather than trying to find other little sort of pockets or pieces?
I think it's a really good question, and it is going to be what is going to deliver the biggest bang in terms of that multiple benefits and multiple outcomes for what is going to be very significant investment. I think, and cities across the UK and more widely are all looking at retrofitting. It's a particular issue for us in Glasgow. We have what we call our pre-1919 tenement stock, about 70,000 dwellings in the city alone, which are, they characterise Glasgow, what Glasgow looks like. They're absolutely, a brilliant model of urban living, but they're horrible in terms of thermal performance. But how we retrofit now, we have actually been doing some work on and some pilots on how we retrofit to Passive House standard our tenement stock. But I think there's a particularly clear example there for us. And also because it's probably the biggest single chunk of investment out of the kind of net zero investment programme that we've got. There are other things that I think, and I think you're right, that challenge of if we can only do one thing, what is the thing that we should do? And for most people, it probably is going to be around buildings. It's going to be around domestic heat in particular. The next thing will be transport. And again, transport, there's very clear connections there through to inclusive growth, through to tackling inequality as well. So you can really see that. The one for me that stands out as being less obvious, but actually I think done right could deliver real benefits, particularly in terms of health outcomes, but is maybe seen at the moment as being a bit woolly and a bit traditionally greeny, if you like, is nature-based solutions. Investment in trees and foresting, in rewilding of places. Again, I think there's probably some more work needs to be done everywhere in understanding exactly how we manifest the benefits that come out of that. But I think it's becoming clear the more we look into nature-based investments, that it's really starting to come through the kinds of benefits that we can deliver for people and communities, including economic benefits, but particularly health-related benefits, I think. So we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss trees for shorthand as something that is kind of nice to have, but not necessarily essential when it comes to just transition. In actual fact, I think done right, it could be something that is almost as, or just as effective as something like a retrofitting programme.
Well, thanks very much, Katie, for your question. We've come to the end of the show today. Thank you so much, everyone who joined us. Thank you, Susan, in particular, for such brilliant answers today. and for articulating your vision of inclusive growth for Glasgow, which has been a real treat. For everyone listening, thanks again, and do sign up to our newsletter if you haven't already to hear about future events. Take care, everyone. Bye for now.
Thanks very much. Bye.